Velthor Prime's spaceport never truly slept. Even in the early hours, when the twin suns of the Velthor system had not yet fully risen above the horizon, the spaceport hummed with life. Ships the size of city blocks docked and undocked in slow, grinding rhythm. Cargo loaders stomped across metal floors on mechanical legs, carrying crates stacked higher than most buildings. The air inside the terminal smelled like engine fuel, hot metal, and 100 different alien foods being sold from little stalls along the walls. Thousands of beings moved through the main terminal at any given moment. Tall, thin Velhari merchants with their 4 arms full of trade tablets. Short, round Brocken travelers waddling in groups, their thick fur coats brushing against everything they passed. Soldiers in uniform from a dozen different worlds stood near security checkpoints, eyes scanning the crowd with practiced boredom. Children of various species chased each other between the legs of adults who barely noticed them. It was loud. It was bright. It was the kind of place that made even experienced travelers feel small. And into this noise and chaos, Empress Varathos of the Dracovan Empire had arrived. She was impossible to miss, even in her travel clothes. The Dracovan were a dragon species, large, powerful, and ancient. Varathos stood nearly 3 meters tall, her scales a deep, burnished gold that caught the terminal lights and threw them back in warm flickers. Her wings were folded tight against her back, pinned under a long gray travel cloak she wore in a quiet attempt to draw less attention. It did not work. Beings still moved out of her path. They still stole glances. Some stopped completely and stared. She walked with her escort around her, 6 Imperial guards in full armor, silent and watchful, forming a loose circle that kept the crowd at a respectful distance. 2 royal attendants moved just behind her, carrying bags and communication devices and all the small things that kept an empire running even while its ruler was in transit. But none of them were carrying what Varathos carried herself. Against her chest, wrapped in a ceremonial cloth of deep red and gold, was Sorrel. Her hatchling was small, impossibly small compared to his mother. His scales were still soft, still finding their final color, somewhere between copper and bronze. His tiny wings were folded against his back in sleep. His eyes were closed. One small clawed hand had worked its way out of the wrap and curled loosely against the fabric of his mother's cloak. He had been sleeping since they boarded the transit shuttle 3 hours ago. Varathos had barely moved during the entire flight, afraid that any shift in position would wake him. She had eaten nothing. She had signed nothing. She had simply held him, one large hand curved gently around his back, and watched his small chest rise and fall. She had a meeting on the other side of this spaceport, a transport to catch, an entire schedule that could not wait. But for 3 hours none of that had mattered. Now they were inside the terminal, moving toward the private gate reserved for diplomatic travelers, and Varathos kept her pace slow and steady. Her guards cleared the path ahead. The attendants managed the logistics. All she had to do was walk and hold Sorrel and get to the gate without incident. It should have been simple. The terminal opened up ahead of them into the main hub, a vast, circular space with a ceiling so high it was nearly lost in artificial cloud cover. The noise level doubled. Hundreds of conversations in dozens of languages blended into a single wall of sound. Overhead, departure announcements played on a loop in 6 different languages, each one cutting over the last before it finished. Cargo vehicles beeped as they reversed. A large group of Velhari traders were arguing loudly near a currency exchange booth, their voices sharp and carrying. Varathos kept walking. She was 3 steps into the main hub when Sorrel woke up. It happened fast. His small body went rigid first. A sudden tension that Varathos felt immediately through the wrap and through her hand. Then his eyes opened, wide and overwhelmed, pupils shrinking against the bright lights. His tiny claws tightened against the fabric. His mouth opened, and then he cried. It was not the soft, sleepy fuss of a hatchling waking from a nap. It was something deeper and harder, a sound that came from the chest, raw and urgent and very loud. Dragon infant cries carried in a way that most species did not fully understand until they heard one. The sound had weight to it. It rolled across the terminal floor and climbed the walls and came back again from the ceiling. It did not stop. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Beings within 20 meters physically flinched. A group of Brocken travelers stumbled into each other trying to back away. A Velhari merchant dropped his trade tablet and pressed his secondary arms over his ears. Several children of various species burst into tears themselves, startled by the sound. Security personnel near the gate looked up sharply, hands moving toward their equipment before they realized what they were hearing. The Imperial guards tightened their formation without being told. Varathos stopped walking. She adjusted her hold on Sorrel, pulling him slightly closer, her large hand pressing gently against his back the way she had done 100 times before when he was restless. It usually helped. It did not help now. His cry continued without pause, high and low at the same time, filling the hub completely. The royal attendants moved quickly. The first one stepped forward and opened a small bag, producing a soft warming cloth that the Dracovan royal nursery staff had packed specifically for travel distress. She offered it toward Sorrel carefully. He did not respond to it. The second attendant pulled out a small sound device that played low harmonic tones, frequencies that were supposed to be soothing to young dragon hatchlings. She activated it near Sorrel's ear. His crying got louder. The head of the Imperial Guard, a broad, dark-scaled Dracovan named simply as the captain, turned and made a sharp hand signal. Within 60 seconds, a royal medic who had been traveling with the group pushed through from the back. She was carrying a full diagnostic kit. She moved to Varathos's side, opened her scanner, and ran it slowly across Sorrel's small body. The scan took 40 seconds. The medic read the results. Then she read them again. She looked up at the Empress with an expression that she was trying very hard to keep neutral and almost managing. Nothing physical. No temperature spike. No pain response. No injury. All biological readings were within normal range for a hatchling of Sorrel's age. She had no explanation. She had no solution. She stepped back. The captain looked at the attendants. The attendants looked at each other. One of the senior advisors who had been standing at the edge of the group pulled out a communication device and began making calls, searching for a specialist, searching for someone who might know something, searching for anything. The crowd had pulled back into a wide ring around them now. Not out of disrespect. Out of uncertainty. No one moved closer. No one offered help. They simply watched from a distance with the expressions of beings who recognized that something was happening that they did not know how to enter. Sorrel kept crying. Varathos stood completely still in the middle of the terminal, holding her son against her chest, her golden scales catching the overhead lights. Her face was unreadable in the way that only came from years of training herself to show nothing in public. Her advisors were talking around her. Her guards were watching the crowd. Her medic had no answers. And her son was crying and she did not know why and she did not know how to fix it, and every being in that terminal was watching her not be able to fix it. The Empress of the Dracovan Empire, whose word could move fleets and reshape borders, stood in a crowded spaceport and felt completely helpless. She pressed her hand more firmly against Sorrel's back and lowered her head slightly so that her face was closer to his. She said his name once very quietly in the old Dracovan tongue. The word that meant safe. The word that meant here. The word that mothers had been saying to frightened hatchlings for thousands of years. Sorrel did not hear it. Or if he heard it, it was lost in everything else. The crowd waited. The advisors talked. The medic stood to the side with her useless scanner. And then, from somewhere near the back of the gathered ring of strangers, someone began pushing forward through the crowd. Not running. Not shouting. Just moving, steady and calm and direct, like a person who had seen a problem and had already decided they were going to do something about it. Nobody paid attention to him at first. He was not large. He was not armed. He was not wearing anything official. Just a worn gray jumpsuit with a spaceport maintenance patch on the shoulder and a streak of engine grease along one sleeve. Just a human. His name was Cole Baxter. He was 34 years old, had been working at Velther Prime Spaceport for 6 years, and at this exact moment he was supposed to be sitting in the maintenance break room eating a sandwich he had made that morning and reading a repair manual for a Class 7 docking clamp. He had been doing exactly that when the cry started. The break room was on the second level, just above the main terminal hub. The walls were thick enough to block most of the spaceport noise, the engine rumble, the cargo beeping, the constant announcements. But when Sorrel's cry rolled through the terminal below, Cole felt it before he heard it. A low vibration in the floor under his boots. Then the sound came through the walls like it had simply decided walls did not apply to it. Cole had put down his sandwich. He had sat still for a moment, listening. Around him, 2 other maintenance workers looked up from their food. One of them made a face and went back to eating. The other shrugged and did the same. Whatever was happening down there was not their business. They were on break. The terminal security team handled crowd situations. That was the system, and the system existed for a reason. Cole had stood up, picked up his work badge out of habit, and walked out of the break room. He did not think about it very much. That was the truth of it. There was no grand decision, no moment where he weighed the risks and made a choice. He simply heard a baby crying and his feet started moving, the same way they moved toward any strange sound in the maintenance tunnels. Not from bravado, not from a need to be seen, but from a very simple and deeply set habit of going toward problems instead of away from them. The maintenance stairwell brought him down to the main floor in less than a minute. He came out through a side door near the eastern wall of the hub and saw the crowd immediately, a wide, nervous ring of beings all facing inward, all very still, all watching something at the center that Cole could not yet see. He could hear it though, clear and continuous and distressed. Cole moved along the edge of the crowd first, trying to get a line of sight. He was not a tall man, average height for a human, which meant he was shorter than most of the species currently standing around him. He slipped between a pair of Velhari merchants and found a gap and looked through. He saw the Empress. He recognized what she was, Dracovan, imperial, important, from the gold scales and the guards and the general energy of barely controlled panic that surrounded her. He had seen Dracovan travelers at the spaceport before, though never one who carried herself quite like this. He registered all of that information and filed it somewhere practical. What he focused on was the bundle against her chest. The hatchling was small. Very small. And Cole had spent enough time around young things, human babies, yes, but also the young of 3 other species he had worked alongside over the years, to recognize what he was looking at. This was not a sick baby. This was not a hurt baby. The cry was wrong for that. Too sustained, too even, without the sharp peaks of physical pain. This was a baby that was overwhelmed. Cole had seen it before. Not with hatchlings specifically, but the shape of it was the same regardless of species. Too much light. Too much noise. Too much of everything coming in at once with no way to filter any of it out. The small body just locked up and screamed because screaming was the only thing left to do. He started moving through the crowd toward the center. People moved aside for him without really meaning to, not because he was impressive or intimidating, but because he was moving with such calm, uncomplicated purpose that stepping out of his way felt like the natural thing to do. He kept his eyes on the hatchling. He kept his face neutral. He breathed slowly. He had almost reached the inner edge of the circle when the guards saw him. 2 of them moved at the same time. They were large, full Dracovan, armored, trained, and currently operating on high alert in the middle of a public situation involving their Empress and her child. Their weapons came up fast and smooth and the message was absolutely clear. Cole stopped. He did not back up. He did not raise his voice. He simply stopped walking and raised both hands, palms out, fingers open, and stood exactly where he was. The weapons stayed on him. The guards stared. Behind them, one of the advisors was already turning to wave him off, already opening his mouth to issue a dismissal. Cole spoke first. His voice was calm and level, pitched just loud enough to carry over Sorrel's crying without competing with it. He did not address the guards. He looked past them directly at the Empress and he said, "I have been around little ones before. Let me try." That was all. No explanation. No credential. No long argument for why they should trust him. Just a statement and a pair of open hands and eyes that were steady and quiet and not afraid. The advisor finished opening his mouth and said something sharp. One of the attendants shook her head. The captain of the guard kept his weapon exactly where it was and his expression said very clearly that he had approximately 0 interest in allowing a random human maintenance worker anywhere near the Imperial hatchling. But Varathos was looking at Cole. She had been watching him since he cleared the inner edge of the crowd. She had seen him move, seen the way he came through the ring of beings without pushing, without rushing, without the nervous energy that everyone else around her was radiating like heat. She had watched him stop when the weapons came up without flinching or stepping back. She had heard his voice. Varathos had spent her entire adult life reading people. It was not a skill she had chosen to develop, it was something that happened automatically when you ruled an empire and every person who stood before you had something they wanted or something they were hiding. She had learned to look past what people said and watch what their bodies did when they thought no one was paying attention. Cole's body was doing something she had not seen from a single person in this terminal since Sorrel started crying. Nothing. It was doing nothing extra. No tension in the shoulders. No shift in the feet. No jaw tightening or eyes widening or hands gripping. He was simply standing there, present and calm, the way a person stood when they were exactly where they expected to be and had no fear about what came next. She looked at him for 4 full seconds. Then she gave a small nod. The captain lowered his weapon slowly, with an expression that made clear he was logging his personal objection to this decision. The advisor made a sharp sound. Varathos did not look at either of them. Cole lowered his hands. He moved forward slowly, telegraphing every step, keeping his movements smooth and unhurried. When he reached a point about 2 meters from the Empress, he stopped and crouched down, bringing himself lower, making himself smaller, taking up less of the space. He did not reach out. He did not try to touch. He just settled into a crouch and became still. And then he started humming. It was not a song. It had no particular melody. It was low and slow and steady, a sound with no sharp edges, no variation that the ear had to work to follow, just a constant and quiet thread of tone that sat underneath the noise of the terminal like a hand pressed flat against a vibrating surface. Sorrel's crying did not stop immediately. It continued for another long moment, full and raw, filling the hub. Cole kept humming. He did not speed up or slow down. He did not look directly at the hatchling. He kept his gaze soft and slightly to the side, the way you looked at something small and easily startled when you did not want to frighten it further. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. Then something shifted. Sorrel's cry broke its rhythm. Just once, a small hitch, a half-second gap like a radio finding a signal. Then the crying resumed, but something had changed in it. The hard edge had softened slightly. The continuous wall of sound had a small crack in it. Cole kept humming. 20 seconds. 30. The cry dropped in volume. Then again. Sorrel's rigid little body loosened by degrees, the locked tension easing out of his small frame the way tension eased out of an engine when you finally found the right calibration. His claws uncurled from the fabric of his mother's cloak. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut against everything, opened slowly. He found Cole's face. He stared at it. The crying stopped. The terminal went so quiet that the distant sound of a docking clamp engaging 3 levels up was clearly audible. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A few beings had their hands raised halfway to their ears and had simply frozen there, not yet sure it was really over. Cole kept humming for another few seconds, then let the sound fade out slowly the way you turn down a volume dial instead of switching it off. He stayed in his crouch. He stayed still. He let the quiet settle. Sorrel stared at him with wide copper-bright eyes and made a single small sound, soft and curious, nothing like the cry that had come before it. Behind the hatchling, Empress Varathos stood with her hands still pressed against her son's back and her golden eyes fixed on the human crouched on the terminal floor in a grease-stained jumpsuit. She did not speak yet. But something in her face had changed completely. The silence lasted a few more seconds. Then the terminal slowly came back to life around them. Beings who had frozen in place began to move again, carefully and quietly, the way people moved when they were not quite sure the danger was over but were willing to test it. A few kept watching. Most turned away and went back to their own business, the way crowds always did once a crisis stopped being a crisis. Sorrel was still staring at Cole. The hatchling had not looked away since the crying stopped. His wide copper eyes tracked Cole's face with the intense, unblinking focus that very young creatures had when something had caught their full attention. One small clawed hand was still loosely open against his mother's cloak. His breathing had settled into a slow and even rhythm. His scales, which had been flushed darker during the crying, were beginning to return to their normal soft bronze color. Cole stayed in his crouch for another moment, then rose slowly and carefully to his full height. He kept his movements smooth. He did not turn away from Sorrel too fast. He let the hatchling track him as he stood, giving the small eyes time to adjust to the change. Then he looked at the Empress. Varathos was watching him with an expression that was still difficult to read, composed and careful in the way of someone who had trained themselves not to show too much. But her eyes were direct and serious and waiting. Cole spoke first, keeping his voice low and easy. He said that the hatchling was not sick. He said there was nothing physically wrong with him. He said that what had just happened was something he had seen before, not with dragon young specifically but with young ones in general, and that the cause was simpler than anyone in the medical team had probably been looking for. He said the baby had been overwhelmed. One of the senior advisors made a short sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, but something in between. The royal medic said nothing, but her expression shifted slightly. The captain of the guard kept his face completely still. Cole did not look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the Empress and continued. He explained it plainly, the way he would explain a mechanical problem to someone who did not work with engines. The spaceport was loud. The lights were bright. The air was full of smells and sounds and movement from hundreds of different species all at once. For an adult, for someone who had been in places like this before and had learned how to filter it all out, none of that was a problem. The brain learned which things to pay attention to and which things to push to the background. But Sorrel was young. Very young. His brain had not learned that yet. Every sound was equally loud. Every light was equally bright. Every smell, every vibration, every voice and beep and announcement and footstep came in at full volume with nothing filtering any of it. It was not too much for his body. It was too much for his mind to sort through all at once. So the mind did the only thing it could do. It locked up and it screamed. Cole paused there and let that sit for a moment. The royal medic had gone very still. She was a small Dracovan, younger than most of the escort, with dark green scales and quick intelligent eyes that had been moving between Cole and her diagnostic scanner since he started talking. Now she was not looking at her scanner at all. She was looking at Cole with an expression that was shifting from professional skepticism toward something more uncomfortable. The head advisor stepped forward at that point. He was a tall Dracovan with silver-gray scales and the kind of bearing that came from decades of standing close to power. He looked at Cole the way someone looked at a stray animal that had wandered into a formal dinner, not unkind exactly, but very clear about where the boundaries were. He said that the Spaceport's medical team had already assessed the hatchling and found no cause for distress. He said that the Imperial medical staff were among the most qualified in the Dracovan Empire and had access to diagnostic equipment that represented the current height of medical technology. He said all of this in a smooth, practiced tone that managed to be polite and completely dismissive at the same time. Cole nodded. He said that made sense. Then he said, quietly without any edge in it, that sensory overload in very young hatchlings would not show up on a standard biological diagnostic scan, because there was nothing biologically wrong. The problem was not in the body. It was in the processing. You could scan every system and find perfect readings and still miss it completely if you were only looking for physical causes. The advisor opened his mouth. The royal medic closed hers. She had turned back to her scanner, but she was not scanning Sorrel. She was scrolling through something, records, reference files, something she was pulling up quickly with the focused urgency of someone who had just remembered something they had not thought about in a long time, or perhaps had never thought to connect to this situation. Her face went pale. It was noticeable even through her dark green scales, a particular stillness that came over her features, the kind that happened when a person found information that confirmed something they did not want confirmed. She read it once. She scrolled back and read part of it again. Then she lowered the scanner slowly and stood very still for a moment. The head advisor noticed and looked at her. His expression asked the question without words. The medic looked up at the Empress. She said, carefully, professionally, in the tone of someone delivering a finding rather than an admission, that there was a documented condition in Dracovan hatchling development. It appeared in the medical literature but was considered rare and was not included in the standard diagnostic protocols because its occurrence rate in controlled environments was extremely low. The condition was essentially what the human had described. Acute environmental overstimulation in young hatchlings whose sensory processing systems had not yet developed the capacity to filter complex, high-input surroundings. She said the standard diagnostic scan would not flag it. She said the treatment approach described, reducing environmental input, providing a single simple focal point, using low steady sound to give the hatchling something uncomplicated to process, was consistent with the management guidelines in the literature. She stopped talking. The advisor was very quiet. Cole said nothing. He was not the kind of person who pointed at being right. He just stood and waited and let the information settle where it needed to settle. It was at this moment that the advisor made his move. He reached into the inner pocket of his formal jacket and produced a small flat disk, a payment token, the kind used for quick and clean transactions between travelers and service providers across most of the known galaxy. It was loaded, clearly, with a sum meant to be generous enough to be flattering without being significant enough to suggest obligation. He held it out toward Cole with a polished smile and a few words about the Empire's appreciation for helpful citizens and the importance of getting back to one's own duties. Cole looked at the token. He did not take it. He was not offended. He did not make a scene. He simply stood there with his hands at his sides and looked at the token in the advisor's hand and did not reach for it, the way a person who had not asked for payment did not automatically accept it just because it was offered. The advisor's polished smile held for a moment and then became slightly uncertain. Then a voice spoke. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Varathos said one word to the advisor in the common tongue, flat and clear and final. Stop. The advisor stopped. The Empress looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to make the meaning clear, and then she turned her full attention to Cole. When she looked at him, it was different from how she had looked at him before. Before, she had been assessing him, reading him, deciding whether to trust what her instincts were telling her. That process was finished now. What was in her eyes now was something more settled. She looked at him the way a person looked at someone they had decided to take seriously. She asked him his name. Not as a formality. Not as a procedural step before moving on. She asked it the way you asked someone's name when you intended to remember it. Cole met her eyes. He said, Cole. Cole Baxter. Maintenance and Repair, Level 3 Certification, Docking Sector 9. The Empress held his gaze for a moment. Around them the terminal continued its low noise, the crowd had mostly moved on, and Sorrel was still watching Cole from the carry wrap against his mother's chest with those wide and quietly trusting copper eyes. Varathos repeated his name once, under her breath, as if placing it somewhere she would not lose it. Then she said, "Cole Baxter. I will not forget that name." The terminal was quieter now. Most of the crowd had moved on. The wide ring of watching beings had dissolved back into the regular flow of the spaceport, carried away by departures and arrivals and the general business of a place that never truly stopped moving. A few beings still lingered at the edges, stealing glances, but the main event was over as far as the terminal was concerned. For Cole, standing in the middle of it, things felt like they were just beginning. Varathos had not moved to leave. Her guards were still in formation around her. Her advisors stood to the side with the careful stillness of people who were waiting to see what happened next before deciding how to respond to it. The royal medic had put her scanner away and was standing quietly with her eyes on the floor, still processing what the records had shown her. Sorrel had fallen asleep. It had happened gradually over the few minutes since the crying stopped. The hatchling's wide copper eyes had grown heavy, then heavier, then finally closed. His small body had gone soft and loose against his mother's chest, one clawed hand still open against the fabric of her cloak. He was deeply, completely asleep in the way that only very young things slept after spending all their energy on something overwhelming, total and immediate and profound. Varathos had one large hand curved around his back. She had not moved that hand since before the crying started. She was looking at Cole. Cole stood with his hands easy at his sides and waited. He was not uncomfortable with silence. 6 years of maintenance work had given him a deep familiarity with quiet. The quiet of empty access tunnels at the end of a long shift, the quiet of an engine that had finally been fixed and was running clean. He knew how to stand in it without filling it. When the Empress spoke, her voice was low and measured. She said that she had traveled through many systems and had stood in rooms with some of the most powerful and educated beings in the known galaxy. She said that in all of those rooms with all of those beings, she had learned to expect certain things. She had learned that expertise announced itself. She had learned that qualified people carried credentials and titles and the visible marks of their training. She said that Cole had none of those things. She paused. Then she said that he had done what none of those people had managed to do today. And that meant something. In her experience, it meant something significant. Cole said simply that he had just recognized something he had seen before. He said anyone who had spent time around young ones might have done the same. He was not being falsely modest, he meant it genuinely. It had not felt like a remarkable thing to him when he walked across the terminal. It had felt like the obvious thing. Varathos studied him for a moment. Then she said, "No. Not anyone would have done it." She had been standing in this terminal with a full Imperial escort, a royal medic and a senior advisory team. Not one of them had done it. The people around her had looked at the situation and seen complexity and risk and uncertainty. Cole had looked at the same situation and seen a baby that needed help. She said that was not a small difference. Cole did not have an answer for that. He nodded slowly and let it stand. The head advisor shifted his weight. He had the look of a man who had accepted that the situation was no longer going the way he had planned and was now in the process of recalculating. He said nothing, but his expression was working hard. What happened next, Cole would later describe to exactly 2 people. His co-worker Mags and his sister back on Earth, and both times he would say the same thing. He would say that he did not fully understand what it was when it happened. He understood the shape of it. He understood that it was formal and serious. He did not understand the full weight of it until later. Varathos straightened. She was already tall. The straightening was more a shift in presence than in height. Something changed in the way she was standing. The travel ease left her posture completely and something older and more formal came into it, the way a person changed when they stepped from a private room into a public one. She spoke in the common tongue clearly so that Cole would understand every word. She said that among the Dracovan people, there was a thing called a debt of honor. She said it was not a financial debt. It was not a favor to be repaid with a gift or a token or a sum of currency. She said that a debt of honor was an acknowledgement, a formal and serious acknowledgement, that one person had given another person something that could not be valued in ordinary terms. Something that mattered in a way that went beyond the transaction. She said that Cole Baxter, maintenance worker of Level 3 certification from Docking Sector 9, had given her something today that her entire Imperial escort had not been able to give her. He had given her son stillness. He had given her, in a crowded spaceport in front of hundreds of strangers, the thing that every parent desperately needed when their child was suffering and nothing was working. He had given her a way through. She said, "I acknowledge a debt of honor to you." formally and completely. Before these witnesses, the guard straightened. Even the advisor went still. The medic looked up from the floor. This was not a casual thing, the way they all responded to it made that immediately clear. This was the kind of statement that had weight in Dracovan culture the way certain documents had weight in legal systems. It was real and it was recorded and it did not expire. Cole stood very still. He said, "I appreciate that. Very much." He said it sincerely because he meant it, even if he was not entirely sure what he had just been given. Varathos gave him a single slow nod. Then she looked down at Sorrel, still sleeping against her chest, and something in her face softened by a degree that it probably would not have softened in front of any other audience. Then the escort began to move. The captain gave a quiet signal. The advisors fell back into formation. The medic gathered her things. The whole group began its slow, organized movement toward the private diplomatic gate on the far side of the hub. Varathos walked with them, Sorrel still sleeping, and did not look back. Cole watched them go. Then he went back upstairs and finished his sandwich. 3 weeks passed. Cole worked his shifts. He repaired a cracked fuel coupling on a mid-range freighter. He replaced the hydraulic system on 2 docking arms in Sector 7. He ate his lunches in the break room and read his repair manuals and had the same conversations with his co-workers that he always had. He did not tell anyone about what had happened in the terminal. Not because he was hiding it. He just did not think of it as a story worth telling. He had helped a baby stop crying. It was a good thing to have done. It was finished. Then the message arrived. It came through the Spaceport's official communication system, flagged as diplomatic correspondence, which immediately put it on a separate routing track that required a supervisor's clearance to release. Cole's supervisor, a broad, tired man named Phil who had been managing the maintenance division for 11 years and considered surprises to be professionally offensive, called Cole into his office with the expression of someone who had just discovered an unfamiliar creature living in his desk. Phil held up the message on his screen without saying anything. Cole looked at it. The header was in formal Dracovan script, which Cole could not read. But the translation was underneath, and the seal beside it was unmistakable, a deep red and gold emblem that Cole had last seen on the ceremonial carry wrap of a sleeping hatchling 3 weeks ago. The message was from the Imperial Court of the Dracovan Empire. It was addressed to Cole Baxter by full name and certification level. It was formal and precise and written in the careful language of official correspondence. It requested, in terms that were polite but carried the unmistakable certainty of people who did not expect to be declined, Cole's presence at the Imperial Court on Dracovan Prime. Travel arrangements were included. Expenses were covered entirely. The purpose of the visit was listed simply as consultative, with no further detail. At the bottom, above the Imperial seal, was a single handwritten line in the common tongue. It said, "I said I would not forget." Phil stared at Cole. Cole read the message twice. Phil said, "Do you want to tell me what this is about?" Cole said, "Not really." Phil said, "Is the Empire going to cause a problem for my department?" Cole said, "I genuinely do not think so." Phil stared at him for another long moment. Then he pulled up the leave request form on his screen with the energy of a man who had decided that some things were above his pay grade and this was clearly one of them. The next morning, Cole's co-workers found his workstation empty. Someone had left a note on his chair. It said, "Gone to the Empire, back in 2 weeks, do not touch my tools." His co-worker Mags read it twice, showed it to 3 other people, and decided that of all the strange things that had happened in her 9 years at Velther Prime Spaceport, this was comfortably in the top 5. Cole, by that point, was already on a shuttle. He had 1 bag, his work badge out of habit, and a small thermos of coffee because he had learned long ago that diplomatic shuttles never had good coffee. He watched the spaceport grow small through the window. He finished his coffee. He thought about what consultative meant, and what an empire might want to consult a level 3 maintenance mechanic about, and decided that the fastest way to find out was to go and see. So he went. Dracovan Prime was not a planet that tried to impress you. It did not need to. Cole saw it first from the shuttle window as they came out of the transit jump. A large, deep green and gray world with 2 moons sitting close together on one side like a pair of eyes. The atmosphere had a particular quality to it, thick and heavy and golden at the edges where the sun caught it, the way old glass looked when light passed through it at the right angle. Even from orbit it felt ancient. It felt like a place that had been exactly what it was for a very long time and had no interest in being anything else. The shuttle descended through cloud cover and landed at a private Imperial dock on the outer edge of the palace complex. Cole stepped out with his 1 bag and his empty thermos and stood on the landing platform for a moment, just looking. The palace was enormous. That was the first and most immediate fact about it. It was built for beings 3 times the size of a human, which meant that every doorway was a tunnel, every corridor was a road, every ceiling was somewhere up in the general direction of the sky. The stone was dark and smooth and very old, carved in places with patterns that Cole did not have the cultural context to understand but that clearly meant something significant. Banners hung from the upper walls in red and gold, moving slowly in a wind that smelled like rain and something else, something mineral and deep, like the smell of a place that had stood long enough to develop its own particular scent. A court attendant met him at the dock. She was a young Dracovan with pale silver scales and a formal manner that was professional without being cold. She showed him to a set of guest quarters that had been prepared specifically for a human visitor. Furniture scaled down, lighting adjusted to human comfortable levels, a small selection of food that someone had clearly researched carefully to ensure it was safe and recognizable. Cole put his bag down. He looked around the room. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a moment about the fact that he was sitting in the imperial palace of the Dracovan Empire in guest quarters that had been adjusted for his comfort, and that 3 weeks ago he had been eating a sandwich in a maintenance break room above a spaceport terminal. He decided not to think about it too hard and went to sleep. The first morning began with a meeting. The royal caregiving staff assembled in a large room just off the eastern wing of the palace, the wing where Sorrel's nursery was located. Cole would later learn. There were 7 of them. Senior caretakers, all Dracovan, all experienced, all carrying themselves with the quiet dignity of people who took their work seriously and were not entirely sure why they were sitting in a room waiting for a human maintenance worker to tell them something they did not already know. Cole stood at the front of the room with no presentation, no equipment, and no notes. He started simply. He said that he was not a doctor. He said he was not a scientist or a researcher or any kind of specialist in child development. He said that everything he knew came from experience. From growing up in a house with 4 younger siblings, from working in environments where young apprentices regularly got overwhelmed, and from paying attention to what actually worked versus what was supposed to work in theory. He said he was going to share what he knew and they could do whatever they wanted with it. The 7 caretakers looked at each other with expressions that were politely attentive and privately unconvinced. Cole started talking. He talked about the basic principle first, that young minds in overwhelming environments needed fewer things to process, not more. He said the instinct when a young one was distressed was usually to do more. To add comfort objects, add sounds, add motion, add intervention. He said that instinct was understandable but usually made things worse, because every additional thing added to the load that the overwhelmed mind was already struggling to carry. He said the first step was always subtraction. Remove what you can. Reduce the input. Give the mind less to deal with, not more. One of the senior caretakers, an older Dracovan with deep brown scales and 30 years of experience in the imperial nursery, said politely that this was an interesting perspective. She said the Dracovan caregiving tradition emphasized responsive engagement with a distressed hatchling. Active comfort, presence and interaction. Cole nodded. He said that made complete sense for most situations. He asked her, respectfully, genuinely, whether that approach had worked in the spaceport. She was quiet for a moment. She said no. Cole said, right. Because the spaceport was the problem. Adding more things to engage with just added to the problem. What Sorrel needed was not more input. He needed one thing. One simple, steady, uncomplicated thing to hold on to while everything else was too loud. He spent the rest of the morning going through specific techniques. Low, steady sound, not music, not complex tones, just a simple hum that the mind could follow without effort. Reducing eye contact initially because direct eye contact was itself a form of input that required processing. Keeping one's own body still and low, so as not to add movement to an already overwhelming visual field. Speaking in shorter, simpler phrases if speaking was necessary at all. Waiting. Letting the quiet do the work. By the end of the first morning, the room was politely attentive and privately still unconvinced. Cole had expected that. He was not discouraged. The second day was different. Cole asked to observe Sorrel directly, not to interact, just to watch how the hatchling responded to the nursery environment at different points in the day. The senior caretaker agreed, with visible reservation. What Cole noticed over 3 hours of quiet observation was specific and useful. Sorrel did well in the mornings when the nursery was calm and the staff moved slowly. He became increasingly unsettled in the late afternoon when the palace activity levels rose. More foot traffic in the corridors outside, more voices, more of the general accumulated noise of a large building in full operation. The caretakers, trained to respond to distress with engagement, would increase their interaction at exactly the moment when Sorrel needed them to decrease it. Cole brought this back to the afternoon session and laid it out plainly. He showed them what he had observed. He did not say they were wrong. He said they were doing something that made complete sense in most situations and happened to work against them in this specific one. The brown-scaled senior caretaker listened to all of it with her hands folded and her expression careful. Then she asked Cole to demonstrate. He did. He sat in the nursery in the late afternoon when Sorrel began to show the early signs of overstimulation, a particular tension in the small shoulders, a certain quality of stillness that preceded the cry the way a held breath preceded a storm. Cole did nothing dramatic. He simply moved to a low position in the corner of the room, reduced his own presence as much as a human in a dragon nursery could reduce his presence, and began the low steady hum. Sorrel's tension did not escalate. The early signs settled back. The hatchling looked toward Cole once, found the sound, and returned to what he had been doing with the calm ease of a small creature that had found its anchor point and was no longer worried about drifting. The senior caretaker watched this happen. She did not say anything immediately. But the next morning, the third day, she came in with a written list of questions. And by the end of the third day, all 7 caretakers were taking careful notes. Cole's final evening at the palace was supposed to be a quiet one. He had finished what he came to do. His bag was packed. His shuttle back to Velther Prime was scheduled for the following morning. He was sitting in his guest quarters with a cup of tea that the kitchen staff had learned he preferred and a quiet kind of tiredness that came from 3 days of unexpectedly intensive work. A court attendant knocked and delivered a message. The Empress requested his company for dinner. Private. Informal. No escort, no advisors, no formal setting. Cole looked at the message for a moment. Then he put on the cleanest shirt he had packed and went. The room was small by palace standards, which meant it was still large by most other standards, but it had been arranged to feel intimate. A table set for 2. Low lighting. Food that had been chosen carefully, a mix of Dracovan and human dishes sitting side by side. Varathos was already there when Cole arrived. She was not in formal dress. She wore something simpler, still regal, still unmistakably herself, but without the full weight of imperial presentation. She looked, Cole thought, like a person who had taken something heavy off her shoulders for the evening. Sorrel was not present. He was sleeping, the attendant had said. Sleeping well. They ate and they talked. Varathos asked Cole questions about his work, his home, his family, real questions, the kind that were interested in the actual answers. Cole answered honestly and asked his own questions in return, which seemed to please her. The meal wound down slowly. The plates were cleared. The room settled into a comfortable quiet. Then Varathos set down her cup and looked at Cole across the table with an expression that was different from anything he had seen from her before. Not imperial. Not formal. Something quieter and more careful than either of those things. She said, "What I want to ask you next, I ask not as an empress." Cole put down his own cup. He looked at her and waited. The room was very quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet that needed to be filled. The easy kind. The kind that settled between 2 people who had spent enough time together over the past few days to stop needing noise to fill the space. Cole waited. Varathos looked at the table for a moment, not at him. It was a small thing, that brief look away, but Cole noticed it because he had spent 3 days watching her and he had not once seen her look away from something before she was ready to face it. She always met things directly. It was part of how she was built or part of how she had built herself. He could not tell which. When she looked back up, her eyes were steady. But there was something in them that had not been there before. Something that had been kept behind the imperial composure and was now, carefully and deliberately, being allowed forward. She said, "Sorrel's father is gone." She said it simply and plainly, the way people said things they had said before in their own minds so many times that the words had worn smooth. Not easy. Just worn. She said his name had been Aerith. She said he had been the kind of person who made every room he entered feel steadier, not because he was loud or commanding, but because he was genuinely calm in a way that was not performed. She said that Sorrel had his coloring. The bronze in the scales, the particular shade of copper in the eyes. She had noticed it the day the hatchling was born and she noticed it every day since. She said Aerith had died 12 days after Sorrel's birth. A medical event. Fast and without warning, the way the worst things always were. There had been no time to prepare and no version of preparation that would have been sufficient anyway. Cole sat with that for a moment. He did not rush to fill it with words. He said, "I am sorry." He said it quietly and meant it completely. Varathos nodded once. She said that she had received many formal condolences from many important people and that she appreciated each of them in the way you appreciated things that were offered sincerely even when they could not actually help. She said Cole's 2 words felt different and she was not entirely sure why. Cole thought he might know why, but he did not say it. Some things did not need to be explained. She continued. She said that since Aretha's death she had been doing two things simultaneously that were each, on their own, among the most demanding things a person could do. She had been ruling an empire, managing the political weight of a civilization that spanned 14 systems, with all the decisions and pressures and responsibilities that came with that. And she had been raising Sorrel. Alone. Without the person who was supposed to be there beside her for exactly that. She said that most days she managed. She had good staff. She had capable advisors. She had a caregiving team that was dedicated and experienced and genuinely cared about Sorrel's well-being. But she said, and here her voice dropped slightly, not from weakness just from honesty, that managing was not the same as being fine. And that there were moments like the one in the Spaceport terminal, where the gap between managing and fine became very wide and very visible and she could not close it no matter how hard she tried. She said the Spaceport had frightened her. Not the crowd, not the political exposure, not the public nature of it. She said what had frightened her was the feeling of standing there with her son crying in her arms and having every resource she had access to fail one after another and not knowing what to do next. She said that feeling, that specific helplessness, was the thing she was most afraid of. Not for herself. For Sorrel. Cole said nothing. He was listening in the way that meant he was actually hearing it, not just waiting for his turn to speak. Varatho said, and then you walked across the terminal. She said it without drama. Just as a fact that she was still, 3 weeks later, turning over in her mind. She said she had been thinking about it ever since. Not just about what Cole had done in the moment but about what it represented. She said that the Dracovan Empire had access to the best medical technology in this part of the galaxy. They had researchers and specialists and institutions dedicated to the health and development of young ones. And not one of those resources had recognized what a human maintenance worker had recognized in 30 seconds from across a crowded terminal. She said she had asked her research team to look into it after the Spaceport. She said what they found was uncomfortable but important. Human caregiving knowledge, the accumulated, practical, generational knowledge of how to raise and comfort and ground young ones, was largely absent from interspecies medical and developmental literature. Not because it was wrong. Because it had never been taken seriously enough to document, share, or study at a formal level. She said the galaxy had been overlooking something significant for a very long time. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said that humans had been overlooked for a very long time in general. He said it without bitterness. Just as another fact. Varatho said, yes. And I would like to do something about at least one part of that. She leaned forward slightly. She said she wanted to establish a program. Formally funded by the Imperial Court, operating across Dracovan space initially and with the intention of expanding further. A program focused on interspecies child development, specifically on collecting, documenting, and sharing caregiving knowledge from species whose practical wisdom had been dismissed or ignored by mainstream galactic institutions. Human knowledge first because that was where the evidence currently pointed, but not exclusively. She said she needed someone to lead it. Someone who understood the knowledge from the inside, not just as an academic subject. Someone who could work across species lines without being intimidated by the differences. Someone who had already proven, in the most direct possible way, that they could take a practical instinct and teach it to people who were skeptical and make them believers by day 3. She looked at Cole steadily. She said, I'm asking you. Cole sat back slightly. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. A mechanic's hands, calloused and capable, more familiar with engine components than with imperial programs and interspecies developmental frameworks. He said, I fixed docking clamps. Varatho said, you also stopped my son from crying in a terminal full of beings who could not. I am less interested in your job title than in what you actually know how to do. Cole was quiet. He thought about his apartment above Sector 9. He thought about his tools hanging in their rack in the maintenance bay, organized in the specific order he had arranged them over 6 years. He thought about Phil's face when he handed in the leave request, and Mags laughing in the break room, and the particular smell of the maintenance tunnels in the early morning before the rest of the shift arrived. He thought about 7 caretakers who had come in skeptical and left taking notes. He thought about what Varathos had just told him, about managing versus fine, about the gap that appeared without warning and could not always be closed alone. He thought about that in the specific way you thought about something when it resonated with something in your own experience that you had never quite put into words. He opened his mouth. And then, from across the room there was a sound. It was small and soft, a single chirp, the particular frequency that Cole had come to recognize over 3 days of nursery observation as Sorrel's version of noticing something with interest. Cole turned his head. Sorrel was in the doorway. He was being carried by a night attendant who had clearly not intended to bring him in. she was already beginning to turn back, mouthing an apology toward the Empress. Sorrel was supposed to be asleep. He had been asleep. But somewhere between sleep and the deep night he had woken, and the attendant had been walking him through the corridor to settle him, and the door had been slightly open, and the hatchling had heard or smelled or sensed something through that open door that had made his small head turn. His copper eyes found Cole across the room. He chirped again. It was the same sound he had made in the terminal 3 weeks ago, right after the crying stopped, that soft, curious, reaching sound. The sound of a small creature that had found something it recognized as safe and was acknowledging it. Cole looked at Sorrel for a long moment. Sorrel looked back at him with the complete and uncomplicated trust of a very young being who did not know anything about imperial programs or interspecies frameworks or the politics of galactic institutional knowledge. He just knew the face of the person who had made the loud world quiet once, and he was glad to see it again. Cole felt something settle in his chest. The same way an engine settled when the last misaligned component was finally put right. He turned back to Varathos. He said, "All right." He said it simply, the same way he had said everything else. No performance. No ceremony. Just a decision made and stated plainly. Varathos held his gaze for a moment. Then something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was in the same family, the expression of a person who had been carrying a particular weight alone for a long time and had just felt someone else put their hand under it. She said, "Thank you, Cole Baxter." Cole nodded. He looked across the room once more at Sorrel, who had settled his small head against the attendant's shoulder and was already drifting back toward sleep, one small clawed hand loosely open in the air. He thought, well, that settles that. Outside the palace windows, the 2 moons of Dracovan Prime sat close together in the dark sky, and the ancient stones of the palace were quiet, and somewhere in the Empire's vast medical and research infrastructure a new file was about to be opened. One that would eventually carry the name of a mechanic from Sector 9 and change the way 100 civilizations thought about the oldest and most human of all skills. The art of making a frightened child feel safe. No announcement had been made. No crowd was watching. No one in the galaxy knew yet what had just been decided in a small private dining room between an Empress and a mechanic over cooling cups of tea. But Sorrel knew. And that was enough.